Unit 4, we will begin discussing disease transmission. Just some historical background on what we thought caused disease. Before the 1600s, the cause of disease was not known. Individuals thought it was either divine punishment if you became ill, commonly thought that disease was caused by bad air because often diseased patients had, particular odor due to pustules or vomiting or other symptomatic issues that caused kind of a smell. Witchcraft was often associated with disease, or that you were cursed. Somebody curses you, and that makes you sick. So the way that diseases were treated back then, and some of these are still valid today, flowers were thought, or aromatics, the smell of flowers were thought to ward off the devil, and the devil often made you sick. So later on we'll see beak doctors. These are doctors that had cone-shaped masks where they would put these flowers to ward off the devil so that they would not become sick. Herbalism was often used, plant medicines, and there is a lot of validity to this. A lot of the medications we use today are man-made extracts based on actual herbs. There are plants that contain, I don't know the exact name, but contain salicylic acid, and that's what aspirin is. So there's really a lot of validity to that. Drinking hot fluids to help sweat out disease. That's something that we currently do, chicken soup. But really having something hot, if you're congested, does assist in breaking up congestion. So there's some validity to that one. Carrying Lucky Charms, okay, not the cereal, but like carrying a cross or some type of, emblem would help fight off disease. A big one was leeches. And leeches is based on the humoral theory of the body. So we have humors or liquids. So these include blood, phlegm, black bile. This is not, medically accurate today. Yellow bile, and that if you were sick, it was caused by an imbalance of your humors. And so leeches were used to draw out blood to balance you back. Of course, sometimes it did cause people to become very anemic, which did not help their medical condition at all. Leeches are still used today. They release a substance called hirudin, which can be used to treat pain. So when a leech is biting you, it wants to release a substance so that you don't feel as much pain and that you would leave the leech in place. Leeches are used in skin drafts. They're used to help eliminate blood clots. And I'm going to put the link for the videos. I'm going to post them at the bottom of the PowerPoint. And because a lot of these videos, sometimes they're available and then they're not available, and I have to change them up. So just make it a little easier. I don't have to keep updating this every time a video decides it doesn't want to become available. Everybody, there were some key events that occurred that led to the understanding of disease transmission. And a key invention was the microscope. So Antoine van Leeuwenhoek, discoverer of the first light microscope. There is a little controversy on who was the actual inventor of this, but we're going to go Anton van Leeuwenhoek in 1668. And this led to very important innovations such as hygiene, antibiotics, led to the development of the germ theory. The germ theory just states that there are microorganisms, and these are the cause of many diseases. So before the microscope, bacteria could not be visualized. And if you cannot see something, it's very difficult to realize that this is the cause of the problem. Some other key discoveries that were very helpful in treatment of disease. Alexander Fleming was discovered penicillin in 1928. And this was kind of an accidental discovery. He had a set of petri dishes that he'd kind of discarded after doing some research on bacteria. And when he looked at them, he found that there was some mold that had contaminated his petri dishes, but where the mold was growing, there was a ringed area around it where the bacteria were being inhibited. So he hypothesized that the mold was releasing some type of substance that inhibited the growth of bacteria, and this is how antibiotics work. This was actually in mass production by D-Day because during World War II, many soldiers died of the infections that they contracted after an injury on the battlefield. So it wasn't the battlefield wound that was necessarily killing them, it was the infection that festered afterwards. This really revolutionized medicine because after this, advancing to the 1940s, 1950s, many more different types of antibiotics were discovered, such as tetracycline and erythromycin. There are a variety of different types of pathogens that we are going to discuss, starting with the tiniest. Prions are actually infectious protein, and they do not contain any DNA or RNA, any genetic material, and these are considered to be not alive. Viruses are also considered to be non-living because they can only replicate if they are infecting a host cell. So they need a host cell to replicate. So by our definition of living things must be able to grow and replicate by themselves. We have single-celled bacteria that can cause disease. And a really key point is, I'll mention right now, most microbes are not pathogenic, but we're just going to talk about the pathogenic ones, and that often tends to have us believe that all of these organisms are bad, and many of them are actually very beneficial and necessary. Protozoa, right, these are single-celled eukaryotic microbes. Fungi, including yeast and mold, and the largest of the pathogens are the parasites. Here's some key terms that we're going to be used when discussing disease. If something is infectious, that means it can be transmitted from a person to person or from an animal to a person. And methods of infection can involve body fluids. This might be saliva, blood, could be pus. We'll discuss vectors. These are healthy organisms that are able to transmit infection. There's a huge number of vectors that can be involved in the transmission of disease. This includes mosquitoes, sand fleas, flies, ticks, mites, cats, rats, bats. Ingestion means that you got sick or you got infected by something, like by eating food or water that was contaminated. Inhalation, you can inhale like respiratory droplets from another individual, right? That's how you catch colds, flu, COVID. Anthrax, you can inhale infectious endospores, we'll get to that later, or mold spores, aspergillosis, so something that you actually are inhaling. Some other terms that are often used in discussing disease transmission: epidemic. Okay, we all know what an epidemic is now. So it's a contagious disease that spreads rapidly, uncontrollably, infecting large numbers of people. When an epidemic spreads to multiple continents or becomes worldwide, and then it's called a pandemic. And the term plague is kind of more of a historical term used to describe infectious diseases that spread easily, right, and can be fatal without the use of antibiotics. We'll get to a historical example of the plague next. So this is the bubonic plague. That bubonic plague still occurs. However, it's now treatable by antibiotics. And this plague circled the world, many times. And we're just looking at the plague of the 14th century. So I will put the video link after the PowerPoint. So in 1347, the Mongols were invading surrounding countries, and this was kind of the initial spread of the 14th century bubonic plague. It killed between 30, depending on what references you look, between 30-60% of the world's population, or about 400 million people. And it did have a significant impact in the world. It caused a real steep drop in agricultural prices. It caused an increase of wages given to workers, and this kind of led to a social reform and development of a middle class. So doctors at this time who were treating patients that had bubonic plague wore these beaks, or they called them beak doctors. And what was in the beak portion, again, were flowers, because it was thought that if you couldn't smell disease, you couldn't contract disease. What causes bubonic plague? Bubonic plague is a bacteria that is spread by the bite of a flea, and the flea is carrying the bacteria. It's the rats that are harboring this infection, and then the fleas bite the rats, and then the fleas then can bite a human. So the flea is the vector. Vector is an uninfected organism that carries a particular disease. So bubonic plague is caused by the bacteria Yersinia pestis. And symptoms of bubonic plague: it starts with flu-like fever or chills. It's called bubonic plague because it causes buboes, or very enlarged lymph nodes. You may have noticed on the previous slide there was a child that showed these enlarged lymph nodes, and the lymph nodes that are affected are typically in the neck or the groin. It leads to multi-organ failure, septic shock. It causes internal hemorrhaging, so that your skin turns black because there's blood pooling under your skin. And so that's why it's sometimes called the Black Death. Again, this disease still exists today. However, it's treated by antibiotics. And also, if you watch, I think if you watch the poem version, the shortened version of bubonic plague, this is very similar to COVID, okay, and that's viral, and this is bacterial. The point is, if a disease is so virulent, that means disease causing, right? If the disease is so serious that it kills most of its hosts, it's unable to be transmitted to another individual. So if somebody has, like, for instance, COVID Delta variant, they were much more ill, so they would tend to stay in bed, they would be home, right? versus Omicron, which wasn't as serious. So you're like, oh yeah, I don't feel well, but I can go to the supermarket, I have to go to work, I have to drop this off at my friend's house. If you're not as sick, it can spread more readily. So a lot of diseases do mutate so that they're not as deadly. And this is what's happened with bubonic plague. We're going to start going through these particular disease-causing agents. And starting with the viruses, right? So I just mentioned previously, they're not included in the classification of organisms because they do not consist of a cell, right? They're non-cellular, so you have to at least have a single cell to be considered to be a living thing. And they're obligate, okay, that means necessary, intracellular, right? So that means within, parasite. So they must live inside a cell. And that's why they are considered to not be alive. Okay, looking at some animal viruses, right? So we have herpes. Herpes causes cold sores, depending on whether it's simplex 1 or simplex 2. Can cause genital herpes. And I know when we say the term herpes, we always think of genital herpes or cold sores, but it's really a kind of a classification. And so chickenpox actually falls under the category of herpes virus. So this type of infection, the herpes virus, it remains latent or dormant most of the time, but then stress, like if you're run down, you're not eating right, you become sick with some other illness, this can cause them to enter the lytic or active cycle. So looking at COVID-19 or coronavirus, and it's called coronavirus because of the spike-like proteins on the surface, which are supposed to look like a crown. And what these spikes do is they assist the virus being able to attach to human cells, right? And then the viral DNA or RNA, depending on the type of virus, is then injected into the host cell. So coronavirus is nothing new. The common cold is classified as a coronavirus. So is pneumonia. Okay, some other kind of novel means like new coronaviruses. There was SARS in 2003, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, and then MERS in 2012. So coronavirus is nothing new. It's just these outbreaks of new coronaviruses that humans don't have any natural immunity to, which are the ones that are the most problematic. Okay, so here is part of this PowerPoint presentation that I continually update. It is now spring of 2023, and a recently declassified document has been provided online by the Office of the Director of the National Intelligence Agency on the origin of COVID-19. There's a link below if you want to read the original document. So here's their assessment of the origins of COVID-19. Here's some areas of broad agreement. The first known cluster of COVID-19 cases emerged in Wuhan, China, December 2019. The virus was not developed as a biological weapon. The virus was not genetically engineered, and China's officials were unaware of the virus before the pandemic emerged. There's two plausible hypotheses on the origin of the initial human exposure: that this was a natural transmission that occurred from animal to human, or it was a laboratory-associated incident. There's not any evidence which is strongly diagnostic of either of these hypotheses. To make things more complicated, Beijing lacked cooperation on the origins. and they've not contributed to proving or disproving either of these hypotheses. And there's numerous information gaps, particularly related to technical data. What we do know is COVID-19 shares a 96.2% genetic identity with a previously identified virus called RATG13. This virus was collected from bats in the Wuhan province, China, in 2013. So COVID-19 could have originated in a bat and then been spread to other mammals such as a pangolin or raccoon dog and then was transmitted to humans. Well, how exactly does this occur? Whenever wild animals are kept in captivity, such as in a wet market, they become very stressed, and stressed animals often, bluntly, get diarrhea, and this allows the shedding of viruses that can be transmitted from one species to another. This is called zoonotic spillover or zoonotic transfer. So here we are, spring 2023, and the current variant of COVID-19 is the Omicron subvariant BA.5. Geographic separation tends to cause genetically distinct variants, but these variants can easily spread from one part of the world to the other. As COVID-19 goes through genetic variation, the variants tend to be more infectious, however, less lethal. Vaccination provides protection from variants. However, breakthrough infections may occur. Most individuals that suffer a breakthrough infection have a less severe case of COVID-19 than those who remain unvaccinated. And I'm sure we're all pretty much aware of how COVID-19 spreads. It spreads through respiratory droplets, right? So you can contract it through your, through your mouth, through your nose, even your eyes. So that was like initially when students came back on campus the fall of 2020, they were required to wear a face mask as well as a shield, right? A shield, because it, was so virulent, and it's still, you still can contract it through your eyes. It's not as common as mouth and nose, and because it's not as severe, we kind of drop the face shield policy. I'm sure everybody is aware of how to prevent contracting COVID-19, avoid large events and gatherings. Everyone, we've seen these circles on the floor of every pharmacy, bank, anytime you're in line anywhere. Maintaining social distancing, washing your hands often with warm water and soap, or if that's not available, the use of hand sanitizers, right? Avoid touching, say you face, okay, should be your face. Avoid touching your face, right? Cover your mouth and nose when sneezing, all right? Sneeze into like the crook of your elbow or your shoulder. And CDC recommending face masks, face cloths in public places. Again, depending on the number of cases, this is something, right, that wear a face mask, don't wear a face mask. Well, it's all kind of based on the numbers of cases in a particular area. So the common cold, right, is the most frequently transferred infectious disease in humans. And there's actually a couple different causes. There's the rhinovirus. Rhino means nose. That's more active in the fall, spring, summer. That's about 10 to 40% of all cases of a cold. There's coronaviruses, okay, not COVID, but other coronaviruses that are most active in the winter and early spring. That's about 30% of identified cases of a cold. And then there is RSV, which is respiratory syncytial virus, parainfluenza, unidentified sources, another 20 to 30% of cases of the common cold. And these viruses, again, mutate very, very readily, so that makes it able for you to get cold once, twice, several times a year. Let's look at another global pandemic, the Spanish flu, from 1918 to about 1920. 1918 was the end of World War I, and American soldiers had been stationed in northern France. When a group of them returned to Boston during the winter, actually on the way over on the boat, many of them became ill. The flu virus is more stable and remains airborne longer when the air is cold and dry. This flu affected about half of the world's population, and there are about 50 million deaths worldwide, 675,000 deaths in the United States. Something that we haven't talked a lot about the last 2 years is just the regular influenza or regular flu. If we look at the infection rates between 2010 and 2020, for this decade, each year there was a range of between 140,000 and 710,000 hospitalizations, and annually between 1,200,000 and 52,000 deaths. So this is still severe indeed. And this virus, similar to COVID, it changes very rapidly, genetically mutates very rapidly, and so new flu vaccines are needed every year. Smallpox is the first disease that has been eradicated worldwide. It's caused by the variola virus. And since it was eradicated worldwide, the last vaccination in the United States was conducted in 1972. Worldwide, the last case was seen in 1977. Smallpox is spread by saliva droplets, and its symptoms include very high fever, and if you see in the pictures, a very severe rash. This is a disease that actually took several hundred years to eradicate. Edward Jenner in 1796 noticed that milkmaids who contracted cowpox did not contract smallpox. So he took a cowpox blister fluid and administered into a boy's arm. This individual, this boy, then did not contract smallpox. So that's how long we've been working on vaccines, all the way beginning in 1796. Chickenpox, the varicella virus, is something that still many cases, though there is now a vaccine. This causes pustules. Each pustule contains millions of new viruses. And a very key thing about viral infection is that the virus, it remains in your body, but however it is dormant. So anytime you have a viral infection, you still have that virus present. In the case of chickenpox, it remains dormant near the spinal cord. And this can be reactivated later in life, and it's then called shingles. And it's very, when you get shingles, it's very regionalized based on like what particular spinal nerve is being infected. Chickenpox, though a somewhat mild childhood disease, can cause serious complications if contracted during pregnancy. So if any of you women did not contract chickenpox or receive the vaccine, that's something you may want to consider. Herpes is a virus that causes sores on the skin. There's two types. There's the oral herpes and genital herpes. And again, once you contract herpes, right, I don't know what they used to say, I don't know, when I was like a teenager, like love doesn't last, but herpes lasts forever. I don't know, because you can contract it from another individual, whether the oral or the genital. But this lays dormant, and then it can be activated by stress, by especially like on the lip area, by sunlight, by windburn. If you have a cold, that could be enough stress for you to have an outbreak. That's why oral herpes is typically called cold sores. And again, the transmission is you come in direct contact with the lesion. Between 50 and 80% of US adults have come in contact with the oral herpes virus. That doesn't mean all of us get cold sores readily, but we have at one time come in contact with this virus. That's how common it is. And about 1 in 6 individuals in the United States have contracted the genital herpes. There are very good antiviral drugs that an individual can take if they start to feel the tingling or initial symptoms of either oral or genital herpes. So poliomyelitis, or polio, is a viral infection excuse me, that attacks the nervous system and causes paralysis. This virus is shed in the feces, and this is what makes children under 5 most susceptible. Okay, young children really, they're potty trained, but they're not particularly sanitary in their use of the toilet. So improved sanitation and hygiene helps, but it's still very, very easily transmissible. There is no cure for polio, only vaccination to prevent it. There was one huge outbreak in New York City in 1960 where 2,700 people were infected. A total of 9,000 people died. And no, we have not eradicated herpes. Again, I will post a video link after this PowerPoint. There are many areas of the world, Pakistan, Afghanistan, the Taliban bans vaccinations. Okay, you could also click on the World Health Organization global case count to see that there are still some cases that occur. I mean, we'll go into vaccinations later, but vaccinations for polio in 1955, actually it started in 1954, there was a large clinical trial out of the University of Pittsburgh. And I just laughed because my brother-in-law was part of the clinical trial, which is, I think, is kind of cool. And this was using the inactivated dead polio virus, okay, which produced humoral antibodies. And Albert Sabin in 1962 innovated the OPV, the oral polio vaccine. And this is a weakened strain of poliovirus. And this is shed in the feces. And it's the Sabin vaccine that is being used now to try to finally eradicate this disease, because the virus invades the digestive system first. All right, this is going to sound really gross, but in areas of kind of maybe lack sanitation that we have in the developing world, many individuals still get their drinking water from a river or common water source, which may contain some feces. But in this case, if you're drinking the water that has the feces from somebody that was recently vaccinated, you yourself receives some protection. Told you it was gross. Just shows the decrease in cases since the introduction of the polio vaccine. Depending on where the virus affects your body, if it's lower in your spinal cord, then maybe you have paralysis of the legs. If it's an upper portion, it can actually affect your ability to breathe, and patients were then placed in iron lung to assist their breathing. This slide's just showing overview, and you obviously don't need to know all of these, but all different types of viral infections, all the different parts that they can infect. They can infect the brain, such as meningitis, also measles, rabies. I just kind of mentioned the common ones. We have the common colds, all the different types of viruses that can cause a cold. Pharyngitis, that's inflammation of the throat. Okay, like this gingivitis, so that's inflammation of the gums and the mouth. Cardiovascular viruses, liver viruses, hepatitis, skin infections. All right, so we mentioned chickenpox, varicella, smallpox. Okay, we have rubella, measles. You're just listing some sexually transmitted diseases, eye infections. Peritonitis, inflammation of the parotid salivary glands, pneumonias. Myelitis, that's inflammation of the spinal cord or affecting the spinal cord. Gastroenteritis, pancreatitis. So basically, viruses can cause mild to serious illnesses in all different parts of the body. Next, we're going to discuss prions, and prions are actually infectious particles, infectious protein particles. They are misshaped proteins, and what they do is they cause the normal proteins in your brain to form this misshape or abnormal shape. This was first discovered as kuru, right? Kuru, the term means to shake, and it's also found in scabies that affects sheep. Mad cow disease affects cattle, and excuse my pronunciation on that, Creutzfeldt-Jakob's disease, which affects humans. So these misfolded proteins cause the other proteins to misfold, and then these misfolded proteins kill the neurons, right? The cells found in your brain, and you start to see these holes that form where the neurons, your brain cells, have been killed. Kuru was first discovered in the Fore. This is a tribal people in New Guinea, and it's a transmissible form of spongiform encephalopathy, or so your brain becomes that spongy looking material we saw on the previous slide. And the reason why it was discovered in these people is these individuals is prior to 1950, a funeral ritual was to cook and eat a dead family member, which I know sounds totally out of the realm of what we would do, but the thought was like, you have this brave, strong warrior, how can we keep the essence of this person? So I mean, it was a reason for doing this. And the brain is the organ most likely to pass on kuru. This can also occur spontaneously, probably like 1 in a million individuals. This can occur spontaneously, right? And if it occurs really later in an individual's life, it probably is not detected, or the person may, be categorized as having dementia or senility. There's also a very rare inherited variant. Okay, but most cases the variant comes from, consuming infected tissues. So cattle that are found to have mad cow disease are deemed to be destroyed and not sold, sold into the food industry. Here's the Kuru tribe. Okay, bacteria, these are the most diverse and prevalent organisms on Earth. There's tens of thousands of different bacteria identified. There's likely many more that exists. You have more bacteria on you and in you than the total world's population. I remember my microbiology teacher in college stating, if aliens came down to study humans, they would study the bacteria in us and on us, since it so greatly outnumbers the number of cells in our body. Okay, that was just his theory. just kind of real brief, if you are going to look at bacteria. So you find a bacteria, you want to identify it. The first thing you do would you look at the shape. Remember, these are single-celled prokaryotic organisms. There's 3 common shapes found, of bacteria. They're either long rods, which are bacilli. They can be round or spherical, called cocci, or they can be spirals. So these are Spirilia or spirochetes. And sometimes these cells have kind of a unique arrangement, right? So here we have picture A, we have 2 cocci. Sometimes the cocci cluster together and form chains or form bunches. Picture B is showing these bacilli or rods, and C is showing these spirilia, they're spiral, or I don't know, I think like corkscrew, kind of corkscrew shaped bacteria. There are some types of bacteria when their environment becomes inhospitable, like, all right, so you have organisms, they're living in a dirt pile, it starts to get hot, it starts to get dry. What they can do is dehydrate and collapse and form a heavy spore coat. So this is a protective covering. So they're dormant bacteria with protective covering, and that allows them to survive very harsh environments, say the winter time, right? And they can be dormant for a very long period of time. So types of bacteria that can form endospores include anthrax, okay, which remember years ago there were some anthrax cases linked to terrorism. This was kind of after 9/11, and the anthrax, I don't even know, I think they suspected somebody of this, but the anthrax was grown in a very large number, and then it was dehydrated, so it formed endospores and mixed with a white powder. So if you don't remember, I know you guys were probably very young, there were some letters sent through the post office that you would open it and the powder would kind of fly out, and if you inhaled the anthrax spores, you became very ill. Botulism, tetanus, these are other organisms that can form these dormant endospores. Many bacteria are able to produce toxins. These toxins are small organic molecules. Toxins can also be pieces of the bacteria that's released or when the bacteria dies. So you can get sick by bacterial infection by the growth of the bacteria itself or these toxins that are released. And often the toxins are more of a problem than the growth of the bacteria itself. An example of a bacteria that releases toxin is Clostridium tetani, which causes tetanus. Now this is commonly called lockjaw. It can affect the jaw, but just keep in mind there are other causes of lockjaw. It can be like stress, it can be like a disalignment of your jaw caused by a car accident. So I'm not really a fan of using the term lockjaw, but I know it is commonly used. So the way that you can track tetanus is through a puncture wound, right? This organism is very commonly found in the soil. I know everybody always says rusty nail, rusty nail. It's not the rust on the nail, it's the soil bacteria. So it has to be a puncture wound. When you have a puncture wound, right, you will get a scab that forms on the surface, but you still have an area underneath the scab, right, that is kind of an opened area, and this becomes anaerobic, right? It's kind of now restricted, it's sealed off from oxygen from the outside. You have this injury, so from the bloodstream. So if the bacteria is residing there in the absence of oxygen, these endospores start to outgrow, and then the bacteria releases a toxin, and then the toxin is picked up by your bloodstream, And what the tetanus toxin does is it prevents muscle relaxation. So you could see like that would be a clenched jaw, clench your jaw. All the muscles are contracting and you can't open your mouth. Okay, so in actuality, this can cause death because if it affects your diaphragm, okay, when you breathe in, your diaphragm contracts, but if the diaphragm can no longer relax, you can't exhale, which means you can't inhale again, right? So you actually would suffocate. Lyme disease was first detected in Lyme, Connecticut, and the initial cases involved children that had symptoms similar to juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. Lyme disease is transferred by a tick vector. So remember, vector is a healthy organism that can transmit infection. Ticks feed on our blood, and the bacteria migrates to the tick's mouth parts and then can infect our bloodstream. A very classic symptom of Lyme disease is a bird's eye rash. However, if your tick bite is like behind your knee or the crook of your arm, there are some parts of the body where the rash is very kind of difficult to detect. The key to Lyme disease is to be able to treat it very early with antibiotics. Otherwise, it does lead to these joint problems and can progress to cause nervous system abnormalities. That's if it's long-term, not treated. This is the one disease that we can call our own. The highest concentrated cases of Lyme disease in the world are the East Coastal states. Yes, this one's ours. Let's look at fungal infections. Fungi are classified as decomposers. That means they can break down organic material that other organisms can't. An example of this would be like cellulose found in tree trunks. Fungi can also live off living organisms, such as humans. And example of fungal infections found in humans include tinea, which cause ringworm, which I have in parentheses because it's not a worm, it's a fungi, it's just that it forms a ring-like colony. And tinea can also cause athlete's foot. Another example of an infection caused by fungi is aspergillosis. And this is where you have a fungus ball that forms after an infection of Aspergilla, which is a mold spores entering your lungs. This is fairly rare disease. Now we'll look at protozoa. An example of a disease that is spread by protozoa is malaria. In malaria, there's a tick vector that contains the protozoa. And the life cycle occurs, you have these sporozoites that form morozoites, and you can see in the picture, part of the life cycle, you have the protozoa living within red blood cells. The red blood cells burst, releasing free hemoglobin, which is very problematic to the human body. This leads to fever, weakness, and potentially death. Our last category of infections are the parasitic infections. These are caused by multicellular animals. Some examples are hookworm, tapeworm, pinworm, heartworm in dogs. Common symptoms of these parasitic infections are diarrhea, weakness, and weight loss. The weight loss is particularly symptomatic in tapeworms. Oh, and yes, you can. Oh, and yes, people have. Swallow tapeworms deliberately to lose weight. not without potential very serious complications. Lymphatic filariasis is often referred to as elephantitis. That's because an individual's leg can swell to the size of an elephant's forelimb. This is caused by nematodes that are transmitted by mosquitoes. These worms, when they mature and mate and replicate at high enough level, block an individual's lymphatic system. The lymphatic system consists of a network of channels that help maintain your body's proper fluid levels. This is done by draining lymph. Lymph is a fluid that surrounds all the tissues and cells of your body. When this lymph can't be drained, it collects and causes edema. In this case, it's so severe that you can see the size of this individual's leg. Over 120 million people are currently affected with lymphatic filariasis. About 40 million are so disfigured and incapacitated by the disease. You can see that this individual would have very difficult time working or even walking. Now you can drain this excess fluid out. However, due to the damage, the permanent damage of this infection, it would only then reoccur. Guinea worms are the largest parasite that affects humans. This is caused by drinking water that's contaminated with water fleas. These are actually copepods that contain the larvae. You do not have symptoms until after about a year of ingesting the larvae. So the worms, they become adult worms. They can be the size of up to 3 feet, the width of a spaghetti noodle. And what happens when the worms mature, right, they want to release eggs so that that's how they replicate. And so the worm will extrude itself, right, or exit your body. So it causes severe pain and tingling. And the concept is you would then stick your hand in water and then the eggs would then be released. In order to eliminate this infection, the worm has to be pulled out very, very slowly. It typically can't be pulled out at once because that would then cause the worm to break. So you can see the individual's kind of rolling. Typically you'd roll the worm on a stick and very slowly remove it from your body. This is extremely, extremely painful, and the disease, kind of the correct name, let's see if I can say this right, dracunculiasis. So Dracula means like dragon, so it feels like, like a dragon or fire being released from your body.